It's Taj of the Beat.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, guys, gals, and non-binary pals to another episode of All the Above, the show that gives you an unstandardized take on education. I'm Jeffrey Garrett, one of your co-hosts, and I've been a high school social studies teacher and a middle and high school principal. And as always, I'm joined by
Manuel Rustin, your favorite teacher's favorite teacher. I'm a high school history teacher. I've been at it for 15 years, and this is All the Above, a show that brings you an unstandardized take on education today, because major media outlets don't really take too much time to discuss our schools. But we know you care about education in America, so we're here for you. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you. Please remember to hit that thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're listening to the podcast on the go, we appreciate you. Make sure you check out our website or our YouTube channel, though, for all of our extras and links to the stories and studies that we reference. So that's aotashow.com. For this episode, Jeff, what's on the agenda?
Well, Manuel, as always, we got a good one for folks. For today's main segment, we have an assessment from yours truly. We're going to dig into some big topics. Topics that quite frankly, I think are the kind that both make people feel hope and inspiration and hopelessness and like the system's never going to change. So we're going to try to walk that fine line today. We're going to talk about how did we get to be in 2019 and still have a separate and unequal school system here in America. So we're gonna explore that topic today.
Race, Jeff. More identity politics, Jeff.
Identity politics.
My goodness.
Fake news.
My goodness. The more you talk about racism, the more it exists.
Well, yes, it's reverse racism.
See,
that's what it is. Yeah. You're the racist for bringing up racism all the time. If you just wouldn't talk about it, it wouldn't exist.
It's like Candyman. You say his name, he pops up. Stop saying his name, it don't pop up.
That's right. That's right.
All right. So up first, though, is our Do Now segment, where we take a look at recent headlines in education, particularly some stories that you might have missed. Time for our Do Now. Let's take a look at some headlines in education. Jeff, how are we doing the Do Now today?
Well, Manuel, it's report card time. We need some grades. We got to see how everybody's doing out there.
Oh, man, my mom's going to be upset.
I know. I told you got to get home before the mail
but
comes,
now she can just check it online, and it's just like, I can't beat it, man.
It's a different world.
All right, so let's check out our first grade for today. Our first grade is, it's standards aligned, below basic.
It's hard out there.
It is quite hard out there.
Yeah.
This is below basic, as in the level of preparation teachers in California have had for this new science test that's being delivered right now as we speak.
Yeah.
California students are in the midst of test-taking season. And one of the tests that California students are taking this time around is a new science test based on the next generation science standards. So the next generation science standards were adopted in 2013 to replace California's previous science standards, which were from 1998, back in the day. And these new standards begin in kindergarten and emphasize critical thinking over rote memorization. These have been adopted by 19 states, and California's science test is considered one of the more rigorous science tests out there. The thing, though, is that a lot of students who are taking the test have not had that elementary grade level instruction in science that the test or that the new standards call for. And a lot of teachers administering the test don't yet have standards aligned textbooks and materials to go along with the next generation science standards. Jeff, talk to us.
Yeah, so I think you've laid out some very important contextual information here. Now, as someone who thinks that, the next generation science standards in and of themselves are a good thing. Like I've read through them. I think they are a rigorous and discipline appropriate way to approach the learning and teaching of the sciences throughout the K-12 spectrum. But there's just a huge question in my head around why we're administering this assessment when we know for a fact that almost no teachers in the state of California have been teaching standards-aligned curriculum.
Right.
Right. So I get sometimes there's like a, there's a delay, right? It takes time for textbook companies to prepare and publish. Science and social studies happen to be the more controversial curriculum development subjects because, frankly, you have folks in more conservative states who want to teach religion instead of science.
Right.
And so I get that there's a process for that.
Yeah.
But what's the rush to administer this test with any type of stakes or public accountability when we know for a fact people haven't been teaching standards aligned curriculum? Students' ability to be successful on this exam is by definition compromised because they haven't been exposed to all the content, right? And to the instruction that is going to equip them to do what is being asked on this assessment. So I don't understand.
Yeah, and students in grade 5 will be taking this test, and there's been students in grade 5 and grade 8 and high school students would be taking this test, but at the elementary level, there's been such an emphasis on math and English instruction that elementary teachers have been spending roughly 3 times as much time teaching math and English language arts than they have any science. So a lot of these students are going to sit down in front of this test, which is a computer-based test, and be asked to show their learning on things that they haven't really had any time to learn or haven't had any exposure to materials based on these standards.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is, it's a legit issue. I think the results around this exam are going to be open to just huge scrutiny, right? Students have not been prepared to be successful on this exam, and that's because teachers have not been prepared and supported to teach in a way that's going to help students be successful on this exam, whether that's providing time for science instruction at the elementary level. Keep in mind our elementary teachers have already experienced and are still in the midst of the shifts to much more rigorous assessments and instructional expectations in English language arts and in math. And now they're also layering on top of that science and eventually history and social studies. So, our elementary educators are put in a really difficult position here, right? Let alone the difficult position our secondary educators are in with this. So, I'm glad we're pushing forward, but I also can't help but feel like we're about to get a bunch of really bad data about our state.
True.
And
about that. So Trish Williams, who served on the California State Board of Education from 2011 to 2018, she's quoted as saying, "Because we have softened our accountability system, it isn't like any school will get in trouble for low scores. Hopefully, it will motivate them." So maybe seeing these results and seeing this data, as ugly as it is sure to be, maybe that would be motivation?
Maybe. And in some cases, maybe there's a good argument to be made that let's take it and just see where we are, and then we can only go uphill from here, and that can be helpful. Okay. But but I can imagine some of the frustration of teachers who are working really hard and wanting to do their best, right? And especially our secondary content expert science teachers who are getting hit with this rough data about their practice that may or may not be fair in the grand scheme of things.
And accountability may be softer than it was in a No Child Left Behind era, but that doesn't mean individual teachers aren't feeling the heat that comes from having weak test scores coming back from their students based on their own school side or administrative situation. So it's soft, but not soft for that individual teacher who's facing this.
Yeah.
All right. On to our next grade.
On to our next grade. Here we go. Our next grade is an A+. As in, you might need to have a really high set of A+ on your transcript in order to get into schools like Cal State LA. Interesting. So here's the story. Cal State Los Angeles is on the verge of becoming what's called a fully impacted school. This means that each year at Cal State LA, there are thousands more students who apply to the school than the campus has funding or space to accommodate. And as a result, campus officials are looking to potentially declare this impacted status, which would mean that they essentially cap admissions to the school. There are several other Cal States across the state that have already declared fully impacted status. And this also means not only is the whole school full, but like each individual academic program within the school is full, right? And as a result, officials are considering a plan for 2020 that would raise admission standards and shrink that fall of 2020 class. So, Manuel, what's going on here?
Yeah, well, this is, for those who don't teach in California, the California State University system has 23 campuses. And of those 23, there already are 6 that have declared this impacted status. In Cal State LA, we mentioned it a few episodes back when we were talking about graduation rates in Cal State University system. Cal State LA, like a lot of Cal States, is seen as a system particularly for disadvantaged students who are first generation or students who don't come from an affluent background. And the Cal State system is really a place where one could pursue higher education and lift themselves up out of poverty, so to speak. And this plan, critics of the plan, a lot of faculty members and students and alumni say this plan actually pushes that further out of reach for students coming from a marginalized background. So it's something that could do undue harm, particularly to students from marginalized backgrounds. But it's also, I think, sort of a, not a side effect, but one of those outcomes of this new college for all push, as a college degree is seen as becoming more and more vital to any basic career field or profession. And now we have more and more students going, but we don't really have the space for that. We haven't built the capacity for all these students. So
we built some prisons, though.
We have built some prisons, and we've hired some private contractors to house inmates.
Yeah, we sure got money for that.
Man, plenty.
Here in California, especially.
Yeah, plenty. So I don't know. This is I'm on the side of looking at this as being quite troubling.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think for those who don't know, who are outside of California and maybe don't know the Los Angeles area, Cal State LA is located in East LA, right? So this is a university that's in a historically Latino community, and a relatively low income area in general, right? And so you have this university being geographically placed in a very convenient area for a certain population, a certain set of folks, right? It's one of 2 Cal States that I think are really like that in LA. Cal State Dominguez Hills being the other one, which is right next to Compton, right next to Watts, and serves, kind of more the South Los Angeles community in that regard. But these are schools that are geographically conveniently located to, some low income areas in the city that are easier for people to get to live nearby, commute to campus and work and not have to spend, hours and hours and hours commuting every day, right? So the idea that this type of raising of academic standards, limiting of the size of an incoming class, and essentially excluding more people in an effort to both respond to some budget pressures for the school, but also in this effort to raise graduation rates for the school over time, right? Feels to me like maybe an unintended negative harm that's being passed on to the community because of the pressure that these schools are facing now. And not that pressure is bad, but we have to say, where are the 600 fewer students who are going to be in the fall of 2020 class at Cal State LA? What's going to happen to those 600 fewer students? Where are they going to get their opportunity?
Yeah, exactly. And the provost of Cal State LA, Lynn Mahoney, she says the university's hands are tied. She points to the fact that enrollment at Cal State LA has increased by 25% since 2012, but actual funding has only gone up about 2%. So the campus already serves over 5,000 more full-time students than it currently has the capacity for. But I don't think this is the right approach for that. Clearly something has to be done, but making it harder to get in and further disenfranchising folks isn't the right solution.
Yeah, I think there was a comment from Antoinette Sadler, who's a member of the Black Student Union at Cal State LA, that really sums this up nicely, I thought. She said, you want to raise your requirements such as SAT scores, but Black and brown communities, we don't get the resources to obtain the scores you all want from us. So yeah, I'm fine with raising expectations as long as supports are raised with those expectations. So either we need a lot coming into our school system to get kids even more ready to meet those expectations, or we need opportunities and places for these students to enter into the Cal State system. And if the reality is Cal State LA is just full, okay, well, how about, Cal State downtown Los Angeles?
Yeah, exactly.
Cal State Hollywood. I don't know.
Cal State Part 2, the sequel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. One last grade. Let's check out this last one. Bad news, Jeff. Bad news.
Yep.
We've got an F. All right. So this F is in reference to our society failing when it comes to addressing the problem of homelessness throughout the nation. According to new federal data, we have seen a 70% jump in K-12 homelessness over the last decade. So new data that was recently released shows that we had 1.3 million public school students who experienced homelessness during the 2016 through 2017 school year, which is a 7% increase over the last 3 years, but again, a 70% increase since the beginning of the Great Recession. Children are considered homeless if they lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. This includes children who reside in shelters or cars or campgrounds because they lack alternatives. But this also includes families who double up and live with another family because of economic hardship or loss of housing. Now that category of homelessness, so families who double up with another family because of economic disadvantage, that accounts for 76% of student homelessness during the school year 2016 through 17. Meanwhile, 14% of homeless youth resided in shelters, and another 6% lived in hotels and motels, and 4% were identified as unsheltered, which itself is a 27% increase over a 3-year period. Jeff, bad grade here.
Yeah, it's an appropriately bad grade. I don't know who exactly gets this grade, but I know
society.
Society, and I know this is not what making America great again could possibly look like.
There you go with your liberal left.
That's right. Fake news, everyone.
Fake news.
So here's what I think about this. We have a problem that we know is a problem, but that a lot of people don't recognize as a problem. Because a lot of people think homelessness and they think, a very disheveled person who might be, pushing a shopping cart, like dirty, smelly, sleeping on the street, right? And that is certainly a major problem, right? Particularly for those of us who live here in Southern California, right? But the reality is, as homelessness impacts schools, it usually does not look that way, right? It's usually not a kid who comes to school looking like they just slept on a park bench last night, right? It's a kid who slept in their car with their family last night, or who's been on their grandmother's couch and tomorrow is going to have to go to their aunt's house. And, because their aunt lives on the other side of town, they now are going to be an hour late to school and miss Mr. Russon's first period, and that hurts their grade in first period, and they miss breakfast, and so they're hungry, right? It's that kind of stuff that is what homelessness looks like in schools in a way that a lot of people don't see, right? And this, I think, is the more insidious part about this, which is we have known and seen for a while that this data is creeping in a negative direction, but we haven't really done much to address it, right? The lingering effects of the recession, putting a lot of families who are kind of on the brink in a much more vulnerable position. We haven't addressed that, and we're seeing the impacts of this with students, depressed wages, housing instability, that set of people who was right on the line before that kind of stuff hit and has verged over now into, a real precarious position.
Right. So there's an organization that works to address homelessness throughout education. It's called Schoolhouse Connection. And their executive director, Barbara Duffield, said that these numbers could partially be attributed to better data, better tracking, better counting of students who experience homelessness, because, as you correctly pointed out, it's tough to identify these students on a face-to-face basis because we have this sort of perception of what homelessness looks like. And as a teacher, a student's not going to necessarily walk up to me and say, hey, I don't have a stable place to live. So the identification part is difficult. So she says the increase shown in these numbers might partially be due to better identification. However, the bigger, more obvious causes are, of course, the housing crisis, the opioid crisis, and just in general, continued lack of livable wage across the U.S., despite what the employment numbers might show, or despite unemployment being at a record low, or what have you. As a teacher, this again, just it's another reminder of the complex challenges that students are dealing with outside of my classroom that totally affects their performance inside of my classroom. Homeless youth, according to the Department of Ed, see a graduation rate of about 64% during the years of these numbers. So 64% graduation rate for students who experienced homelessness during the 2016 to 2017 school year, as compared with the national average that year of 84%. So that's a 20% gap right there. And as you correctly pointed out, this just shows the critical need to really address these issues and really address the challenges that come with living really right on that edge, that borderline.
Yeah, I think this issue really dramatizes the intersectional nature of these social challenges that we have, right? If you're someone who maybe doesn't find yourself all that motivated by homelessness, right? Well, if you care about kids and you care about schools and you care about democracy, then you better care about homelessness, because the things that are impacting students' ability to function and succeed well in school are things like homelessness,
right,
are things like healthcare, right? So you might hear about issues like $15 minimum wage and, Medicare for all and think, well, that's lefty, liberal stuff. And I don't like that. When that boils down to human beings, that's about homeless kids in school, right? That's about young people who deserve a chance, and we can do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. We had an episode last season about supporting our foster youth, for example, as one particular subset of students who may be experiencing a lack of stable long-term housing. So check that out for more information about particularly foster youth and where they fit into this picture. But again, go to our website, AOTA Show, to get links to these articles yourself, because there's a lot to it. This report, we'll link it on our website, and this is a legitimate F that we just handed out. And I hope that our very educated, motivated audience will dig into the details and do what they can to be advocates for homeless youth and all youth in their school and in their districts and in their communities.
Yeah.
All right, folks, that does it for today's Do Now. Up next is our assessment.
If I told you that at some point in history, America had two school systems, separate and unequal, you might think I'm talking about the America of the 1940s. But what if I told you that I'm not talking about the 1940s, I'm talking about today? We have ample data to suggest that today, in 2019, we have regressed to maintaining parallel school systems in this country that are separate and unequal. How did we get here? Well, let's take a quick walk down memory lane. In 1892, there was a famous Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. It's widely considered one of the worst decisions the court has ever handed down. Segregation in things like train cars and schools was legalized with the idea that separation of the races doesn't confer any badge of inferiority to the colored race, so long as the accommodations were essentially equal. Now, everyone knew that they would not be equal, but the court ruled this way anyhow. Then, fast forward a half century, and in 1954, the court handed down one of its most celebrated cases in history, Brown versus Board of Education. This case overturned Plessy and declared segregation inherently unequal, and is considered the judicial backbone of much of the civil rights movement. So, what the heck happened? How do we go from a Supreme Court ruling telling us we had to integrate schools to 60 years later having schools that are as racially isolated as ever, and with obvious inequality in funding, resources, facilities, and staffing? How is it that in a nation where education is always touted as the most important vehicle for opportunity, that we have such obvious structural barriers to equality baked into our schools? The answer has three parts: geographic school districts, property taxes, and Detroit. Let's start at the top. In America, education is considered a state responsibility. That means states decide upon things like standards and graduation requirements, and they authorize the operation of local schools by districts. But over the last 75 years, as suburbs grew and Americans began to segregate more residentially, states authorized many new school districts that were segregated as a result. This was, of course, accomplished largely with racist practices that kept black people and people of color in general trapped in poorer communities with lower property values. School districts became not just politically drawn boundaries between communities, but racially segregated boundaries through which children would not be able to pass to attend school. Now that brings us to our next item on the list, property taxes. In America, about 45% of school funding comes from local property taxes. Wealthy communities with high property values can tax themselves at relatively low rates and generate large revenues to fund their schools. Sometimes, right next door or even across the street, a poorer community with low property values might have to tax itself at higher rates and still not generate equal dollars for school funding, let alone the additional dollars it takes to meet the needs of students struggling with poverty. And this brings us to our final point, the city of Detroit. Almost everyone in America has heard of Brown versus Board of Education, but almost no one has heard of a case that happened 20 years later and began the systematic dismantling of efforts to integrate schools, and that laid the foundation of our return to a system of legalized, separate, and unequal schools. In the early 1970s, meaningful integration within the Detroit public schools was almost impossible. The schools were so overwhelmingly black that in order to achieve any integration, the state would need to consider integrating schools across district lines, where wealthy white communities had formed separate school districts just outside the city. The folks suing the state to integrate won in federal court and won in the U.S. Court of Appeals. But in a 5-4 decision called Milliken versus Bradley, the Supreme Court ruled that the solution to integrate schools in the Detroit metropolitan area was not permissible. Since those districts had no history of Jim Crow-like legalized segregation, they could not be mandated to integrate across district lines. This decision meant that as residential segregation flourished over the last 50 years, there would be no legal remedy to the return of separate and unequal schools between wealthy and poor districts, even if they were right next door to one another. So, that brings us to the big question of today. In an era where education is more important than ever, where it is positively associated with everything from lifetime earnings to lifespan itself, what do we do to address the fundamental inequalities in this new separate and unequal educational world?
Jeff, I appreciate your comments there. In particular, I appreciate that you're able to sort of lay out the history of how we got here in really simple terms, because a lot of times as educators, as people who are really interested in education and education matters, we get so lost in the minutia of each report that comes out showing inequitable funding or problematic curriculum that a lot of times sort of just the general historic framing of how we got here is either lost or, you know, people might not really know much about it. So the step-by-step way that you laid it out, I definitely appreciate that myself as an educator. To the general question about like, what do we do about this? That's something that I've been sort of grappling with personally in my 15th year of teaching, as I sort of become a lot more, I guess, pessimistic about what schools are going to look like in the future, given how long they have looked the way they do now in terms of the racial segregation. I'm beginning to be of the belief that the problem is so much larger than the school system. So when we talk about segregated schools, obviously we got to talk about segregated housing and the long history of racially segregated housing patterns that continues in different ways today. So, you know, obviously we go into the history of redlining, the history of, you know, racial housing covenants. So we teach in the Los Angeles area, and the demographics of LA and the way different neighborhoods are made up. It's not by accident. There's a long history of, you know, housing patterns that developed South LA in the way that it is today, for example. But that history is so long and so extensive. And then we think about add white flight and add gentrification and add all these other things. Like housing, in my belief, is going to remain segregated for long after I'm gone. And that has me thinking about schools and whether or not the school system itself is going to be the place where that gets resolved, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the more I have thought about this issue, the more I understand and on a certain level share your pessimism.
Right.
So thanks for joining us today, folks. It's been a good episode.
Done.
Done.
It's a wrap.
It's hopeless. Let's all go home. No, I share the pessimism, but I think I also have kind of in some ways like an undying sense of optimism in the sort of
I'm glad somebody does.
Kingian philosophy of the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? And we have experienced a multiple decades long period of sort of regression, right? A major milestone win with Brown versus Board of Education, some initial movement towards integration and towards greater equality and equity, and then a pretty systematic walking back of all of that. And it's not that there hasn't been resistance or hasn't been folks really mobilizing to continue the march towards a more just future, but the other side has been more effective, frankly. And there is a part of me that says maybe the battleground, maybe the theater of this battle needs to shift from one that has focused more on integration to one that actually borrows some of the strategy from the earlier civil rights movement, right? The legal cases that set the groundwork for Brown versus Board of Education, a significant number of them were really about raising the costs of a separate and equal society, right? So, okay, if we're going to be separate, then what does equal actually require, right? So if we're going to have schools that are, wealthy, well-funded in, Santa Monica and Malibu or in Beverly Hills, and right next door we have schools in Los Angeles Unified School District that are, dramatically lower funding and poorer resources, then maybe we need to actually take up the mantle and say, like, okay, we have separate schools and we're not going to fight that front. We're going to say, let's make them equal. And what does equal actually look like, right? In places where we have concentrated poverty, concentrated exposure to traumatic experiences and those sorts of things, that means we need even more resources than the wealthier communities get. And in some cases by many orders of magnitude, to hire the counseling, mental health professionals, to lower class size ratios, all of that kind of stuff, right?
And how we're going to get there, though. That's the thing. When you think about how much is required to really have the separate be equal, that's, study after study comes out that shows $223 billion more that went to
23
billion, 220, that's a lot. 23 is still a lot though. 23 billion more that went to districts predominantly serving white students than students of color. Like, to shift that, the size of that shift that would have to happen when we look at the actual funding policies and tying funding to property taxes and all that, that's where my pessimism grows, because that's just a tall ask when you look at how long we've been struggling with this as a nation. You
don't think we can rely on the goodwill of our wealthy and white neighbors?
You know what? Thanks to those tax cuts, maybe, some of that is trickling down. It trickles down and stops first at the private yacht industry.
Yes.
But then what's left maybe will trickle down
I
to
think we should take Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett's couches and just turn them upside down and shake them vigorously, and that'll be enough loose change to fill the gap.
Man.
They won't even notice it's gone.
They wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're raising like a very fair point there, right? And my optimism is not so blind as to recognize that, like, this is going to be really hard. I think what does give me some hope is that, like, it's not like folks in 1935 were looking at the situation and feeling like, man, we have a clear path to victory, right? Like,
that is true.
They had a just as high, if not a much higher mountain to climb. And I wonder if actually this opens up new possibilities for both litigation and actually just like political mobilizing, right? Because if the reality is there's not necessarily political will for people to just integrate schools, right? There might be more political will to do things like create equitable funding. There might be more political will to do things like incentivize more diverse residential patterns in communities than currently exist, right? Things that over time will help create more integrated and more just distribution of resources in our schools.
Yeah, but even with that, I was at a school recently where it was a school that I guess you would consider most of their community to be more on the affluent side, and they had several positions on their school staff fully funded by parent contributions. Their librarian, 100% fully funded by parent donations. Their computer technology teacher, fully funded. So even in the sense of legislating more equitable funding systems, there's still going to be that inherent inequality until the actual residential patterns are integrated.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to is the multi-pronged, like sort of holistic approach with which we're going to have to view this, right? I think there's a growing number of people who understand this in our society, like particularly around the like sort of interesting nexus where the right and the political right and left have kind of come to some agreement about mass incarceration being out of control.
Well, thank you to President Trump. Finally, somebody came in.
Well, Kim Kardashian, really. And Kanye.
Hey.
But in all seriousness, right? Like this odd intersection point where the folks on the right are like, we don't really care about, racism against black people and stuff, but we're spending all this money on all these prisons, right? We're locking up all these people for ridiculous, low-level, nonviolent offenses. We're empowering this sort of overwhelming police state, and they don't like that stuff, right? And then folks on the left who are talking about, racial justice and destroying families and communities and reparations and like that angle, right? And I do wonder if there's another unexpected intersection point, right, where the folks on the right are deeply committed to this idea, which some people might say currently is more mythology than real, but this idea that education should be the great giver of opportunity in our society, right? And so maybe there's a place where there's some openness and some receptivity to this idea that we should make that vision a reality, and that's going to take some larger systemic changes, right? At the same time as folks from the left are pushing on like this is about justice and racial equality and all of that.
And we had a guest on the previous episode, Siobhan Taylor, who works in trauma-informed care, and one thing that she said in our one-on-one discussion was this idea about whether or not integration is even the goal to work towards, because for one, if it's integration in the curriculum still whitewashed or still dominant American, dominant narrative, traditional instruction that doesn't really work for children of color, is that really the direction to go? And, as a teacher whose students are primarily students of color, I'm starting to realize that, my pessimism towards seeing integrated schools and seeing equitable funding is driving me towards sort of like a not good place. So my response to that and my own way of sort of dealing with that in my profession that I love so much is just really focusing on the young men and women in my class. And, we have tours come through because, my district happens to be open enrollment. And a lot of times the people on the tours look quite different than the young men and women sitting in my class. And there's that ongoing discussion about the extent to which families want their children, white families want their children sitting amongst black and brown kids. And I really hope that, this hope that you have for there being sort of a common spot for the right and left, political right and left to meet on the topic of education on this issue. I really hope that that's there. But, you know, when you see studies like what we reported, I think 2 or 3 episodes ago about like just the racial bias behind the interpretation of the word urban, and just like, it's just so pervasive, the problems, and it just feels overwhelming to really think that this could be sorted out anytime soon. But that's why we have great leaders like you to keep the optimism going.
Don't worry, I got you.
Man, leave it to me. And it's just like, man, throw the whole system away. But
well, so there is, I agree that in my mind, integration integration as I think it became to some extent to be understood about in the sort of initial wave of integration, 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Became, for better or worse, this sort of like, we need to have students of color in proximity to white students.
Yeah.
Right? And I think what was missed there was the real point of integration. There's nothing that we need to get from white folks by being next to them as a part of integration. What is needed is access to the resources and funding and the structures that provide positive experiences and privilege, right, to white students in those schools, and wealthier students in those schools, needs to be accessible to all. And in general, I think in our society, the things that everyone uses, we tend to take pretty good care of, right? Now, there might be some exceptions, right? But like in general, you go to our national parks, you drive on our interstate highways, you go to our airports, like we have highly functional, well taken care of public infrastructure in those spaces because everybody uses them, right? And it's the places where you start to segregate and stratify that we really begin to see this erosion, right? So the one part of this to me that really does feel like integration is a valuable pursuit unto itself is the idea that if we create more things as a public good, more schools as a public good that we all use, we will take better care of them, right? I don't have any illusion that like that's going to happen tomorrow or next week or anytime soon. But I do think there are unnatural patterns of segregation that exist in our society, not because people are inherently, have inherent malice towards others, but because if you want to live in a safe area, if you want to live in a place where the schools are better, right? Like you wind up behaving in a certain manner. And so I think there's some things we can do to interrupt those patterns, right, that reinforce these systemic racism and inequity.
I agree with you. I'm thinking about a book I read recently, The Color of Law. I'm sure a lot of our viewers have heard of it. It sort of lays out sort of the history of the federal government's involvement in creating the racial housing patterns that we have today. And so I think about that because you use the word unnatural in terms of, sort of these unnatural housing patterns, and they are there. And I think about the missed opportunity we had to allow for an integrated, just society through Reconstruction and beyond that. Sort of we dropped the ball, and when I say we dropped the ball, I mean the white American government dropped the ball on policymakers. But hopefully there is room for addressing some of those ills of the past and bringing justice to those ills of the past, because education, especially in a democracy, should be a public good. And as a public good, it should be something that serves everybody and that everybody sees as sort of being a inherent, fundamental, important part of being an American and being in our nation. There are so many details to this conversation, so obviously this is an ongoing conversation. In episode 3, I believe it was, we talked about school choice and the role that school choice plays in reinforcing or addressing racial segregation. So go back to episode 3 if you missed that. And, this is one of those topics where pretty much everything else we discuss goes back to schools as inequitable systems, or the school system as being inequitable and resources being inequitably distributed, and the need to address that and do something about that.
Yeah, and if that isn't enticing enough for you to go back to episode 3, there's also a fantastic, if somewhat grainy, picture of me in the 4th grade with a outstandingly bad flat top that my dad cut on top of my head.
Yeah, there's that.
So you can check that out too.
Absolutely. All right, so that does it for this segment. Up next, we have our class dismissed, but let us know what you think. I'm a little bit more of the pessimist on this. Let us know. Drop some comments below. What do you think needs to be done? What sort of work or steps need to be followed in order to address the school segregation that we have today? So drop those comments. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And up next is our class dismissed. All right, folks, it's time for Class Dismissed, a segment where we like to shout out people doing great work in education. And for this episode, we would like to shout out all of you teachers out there that are currently dealing with testing season. As reported during our Do Now, it's that time of year where tests are being administered, some of them brand new tests, such as tests based on the next generation science standards. And we know that your work and what you're doing with your students can't be measured by a simple test score. But nonetheless, you do what you can to prepare your students so that they can exhibit what they know and what they've learned. And we know it's a stressful time of year. We know it's a kind of frazzly time of year, but you're doing the great work in the classroom and you're showing your students that they are bigger and better than a test. And you're preparing them, though, to still do the best that they can. So we salute you. We see you. I'm dealing with the same thing myself. And you know what? It's part of the job, I suppose. So shout out to you guys.
Yeah, we also want to extend a shout out to all the educators across America. This is that interesting time in the year when you get to March, April, where it feels like, man, we have been in school for a long time. And then you look at the calendar and it feels like, man, we still have like a couple months to go. So hang in there. We see you. We acknowledge the good work you're doing. I know for some folks, spring break just happened. So I hope you're feeling rejuvenated and ready for the sprint to the finish line. For other folks, you're like trying to make it to spring break in a week or two here. And you too, hang in there, almost there, and, enjoy your well-deserved time off.
Indeed. All right, folks, remember, go to our YouTube channel for all the episode extras, and in addition to previous one-on-one videos, all the previous episodes, my teacher vlog, Rustin's Room, and hit our website, aotashow.com, for links to all the articles and studies that we've mentioned. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.